Hi, good evening, everyone. So last week we discussed about PMT in malignant conditions, and we discussed about the stem cell source, the type of transplants, the type of pre-transplant workup which we do for most of our patients, and the conditioning regimens, the principles of conditioning regimens, the complications, the early complications and immediate late complications of transplant. So that all we have discussed in the previous class. We discussed about the most common malignant conditions which we do stem cell transplant. Today, I'll be discussing about the role of bone marrow transplant in non-malignant conditions. So, certain things would be overlapping, but most of them, this is purely to intended to understand what are all the conditions which you do. How do they differ from a transplant in a malignant condition? So, to begin the class, so again, like I said, yeah. So the more appropriate term is hematopoietic stem cell transplant. So we are basically transplanting the hematopoietic stem cell. So in the non-malignant conditions, the most common type of transplant which we are doing is allogenic stem cell transplant. Because in the underlying disorder, based on the disorders, so there would be some deficiency in one of the functions of the hematopoietic cells. We are just trying to replace those cells which that patient otherwise wouldn't have. So most of the time there is a donor and it's always an allogenic stem cell transplant. So the pre-transplant workup and the would be same for even for non-malignant conditions for the like evaluation of all the organ functions, cardiac, renal, lung functions, liver functions, and everything. But however, there are certain caveats. So, what are all the conditions in which we can consider a hematopoietic stem cell transplant in non-malignant conditions? So most of them are in children. So, the pediatric age group has a lot of non-malignant conditions where hematopoietic stem cell transplant is curative. Among them, primary immunodeficiencies, mainly severe combined immunodeficiency and certain non-SCID conditions like Wiskott-Talrich syndrome, phagocytic disorders. Hemoglobinopathies, these form the largest chunk of non-malignant conditions in children. Sickle cell disease and thalassemia major, the two most common hemoglobinopathies which are curable with a hematopoietic stem cell transplant. Inherited bone marrow failure syndromes. Aplastic anemias we see mostly in the middle-aged adults where it's an acquired disorder, mostly autoimmune. Here again, allogenic stem cell transplant is curative. And the other syndromes which present from early age to early adulthood, Fanconi's anemia, Schwarzman diamond syndrome, dyskeratosis congenita, hemakaryocytic thrombocytopenia. All of them called progressive cytopenias after birth at different age points. So even in these conditions, when there is profound cytopenias, not recovering or requiring or have become transfusion dependent, allogenic stem cell transplant is the cure. Certain metabolic and genetic conditions like infantile osteopetrosis, mucopolysaccharidosis, leukodystrophies, where there is a deficiency in enzymes, the allogenic stem cell transplants try, by doing an allogenic stem cell transplant, the leukocytes of the donor try to replace some of these stem cells, and they are likely to, even if not completely, at least partially correct certain disorders, multiple sclerosis, and certain autoimmune disorders. So again, multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disorder of the brain. There again, there is a role for hematopoietic stem cell transplant. Among the hemoglobinopathies, thalassemias, thalassemia is the most common one. So, and hematopoietic stem cell transplant in thalassemias is curative. So, if we see the widest experience has been HLA sibling matched donor from a sibling matched donor. If matched sibling donor is not available, alternative donors have also been tried for hematopoietic stem cell transplant. So if we look at the outcomes, this is the CIBMTR registry, which shows that the 5-year survival is to the tune of 70 to 80% when using different sources of stem cells, be it bone marrow, peripheral blood, or cord blood. So how are these thalassemia patients? Do all the thalassemia patients require transplant? No, it's mostly in the thalassemia major patients. And the basic, who are the best transplant patients are those who present earlier in life. The earlier they present, the lesser the transfusions they receive, the more likely the transplant is going to be good. So most of what happens frequently in developing countries like us is where most of the patients receive continuous transplant and there is no good iron chelation. Most of them end up with iron overload with a lot of hepatomegaly, and they present at a later age. They come to a transplant or a hematologist at a later age for transplant. Most of the times they are managed by pediatricians or general physicians where they give chronic transfusion therapy. So the later the age, the more the complications and lesser the success of transplant. So generally we take the cutoff age as 14 for an optimal outcome in a matched family donor transplant for a thalassemia major. Because what we have seen is beyond that age, the transplant outcomes are going to be bad because of the conditioning regimen toxicity or graft versus host disease. So most importantly, before proceeding to transplant, like I said, when we evaluate the organ functions, here we have to have an accurate assessment of iron content in liver and heart. Because of the conditioning regimen which we use, they can precipitate liver and heart failures. For the most standard and gold standard method to estimate serum iron liver biopsy is liver biopsy. But again, the problem is it's an invasive procedure, and a lot of times in these patients there can be a problem in bleeding with the liver biopsy. So there are certain non-invasive methods like fibroscan and an MRI where we can predict the liver fibrosis secondary to iron overload, as well as even a cardiac MRI can sometimes give us an idea about the iron overload. So based on that, we can select candidates for stem cell transplant. So there is this Pesaro classification for risk assessment in hematopoietic stem cell. As a matter of fact, even for most of the hemoglobinopathies which are transfusion dependent. So the class 1 patients where there is inadequate, if you look at the 3 factors which we take: portal fibrosis, hepatomegaly more than 2 centimeters, and inadequate chelation. So those who don't have all the 3, they are class 1 patients, they have excellent outcomes. Or someone who have 1 or 2 of them are class 2, and class 3 are the ones which have all the 3 of them. In class 3, there is a increased risk of organ related toxicity, be it the liver or cardiac. So however, that's why it's very important whenever we diagnose the patient of thalassemia, what we tell the pediatricians is try to start early chelation, monitor them for early chelation, and look for potential matching. So the conditioning regimen in thalassemias includes standard myeloablative regimens. In thalassemia, the pathology is because of ineffective erythropoiesis, there is a marrow hyperreactivity. So there is increased red blood cell production, because of which there are a lot of bony changes. There is a lot of splenomegaly and hepatomegaly. So here we consider myeloablative condition because we want to ablate the marrow and allow the donor cells to home the marrow and start producing the donor blood. So most of the time we use myeloablative conditioning, which is busulfan and cyclophosphamide, the most common regimen, which is standard. Like busulfan is known to cause hepatic sinusoidal obstruction syndrome or veno-occlusive disease, what we call. And these patients who already have iron overload, busulfan just precipitates that toxicity. And pyridocyclophosphamide also causes a lot of cardiotoxicity in transplant setting, which we don't see often. But in patients with thalassemia with significant iron overload and improper chelation prior transplant, hydrocyclophosphamide can precipitate toxicity. That's why we have to try to catch hold of the patient as much as they are in the class 1. So sometimes to decrease this toxicity of busulfan and cyclophosphamide, certain non-myeloablative regimen, which includes treosulfan, fludarabine, and thiotepa, are also used. However, still Busi has been the standard conditioning regimen which has been used, and the data about this non-myeloablative regimen is also used. There is always a fear of graft failure in these patients because you're treating an overreactive marrow rather than an ablated marrow or someone with a low bone marrow cellularity. So in these patients, prophylactic defibrotide to prevent veno-occlusive disease, we particularly use, especially when we are using busulfan. So can we look for alternate donors? Because the chances of having a matched sibling or a family donor and who is not affected by thalassemia is sometimes difficult, and most often we may not get a donor. In such cases, we can think of the other donors, matched unrelated donors, where previously these patients had certain increased risk of graft failure or graft GVHD, but now with effective GVHD prophylaxis with ATG, MMF, and short course methotrexate, the outcome has become comparable to the matched sibling hematopoietic stem cell transplant in terms of overall survival, treatment-related mortality, thalassemia-free survival, and acute GVHD. Now, coming to the umbilical cord blood transplant, because in umbilical cord the cell doses are very less, because for a person most of the time cord blood the quantity is less and the total cell dose per kg body weight is less, there is a high chance of graft failure. When we are going for a cord blood transplant in thalassemia patients, we usually prefer a double cord blood units, because with that the cell dose is higher and the chances of graft failure are low. And even with this, there are comparable outcomes in terms of overall survival, thalassemia-free survival, when we use 2 units instead of 1 unit, especially when the total nucleated cells are more than 25 into 10 to the power of 6 cells per kg of the recipient, not the donor. So, but the other source, haploidentical transplant, generally it's still under investigations. We don't do it outside the clinical trial, but some haploidentical transplant, the parents are the immediate donors, so there is always a scope, to find the donor easily and take the child for transplant. However, to get a T-cell deplete graft, this is again associated with high rate of infections, and there is increased risk of graft failure because of the allosensitization and hyperactive marrow. So sometimes this can be overcome by a pre-transplant over-transfusion and immunosuppressive therapy. But however, it's still more investigational kind of thing. Most of the time, we either, because these patients, they give us sufficient time to look for a donor. Unlike malignant conditions where the risk of disease relapse and death due to leukemia gives you limited time to find a donor. Thalassemia is more of a chronic disease. So you give good iron chelation and transfusion therapy and look for a potential donor if you don't have a matched sibling donor. So haploidentical still under a trial. A lot of other methods are being tried to decrease the transplant-related mortality or failure. Now, in thalassemia patients, the most important post-transplant considerations include mixed chimerism. So even despite giving a myeloablative regimen in a hyperactive marrow, the incidence of mixed chimerism, the word itself suggests that they have the donor as well as the recipient cell lines after transplant. So it's to the tune of around 10 to 12%, which you don't see normally in leukemia transplants. So when there is increased this chimerism, especially post-transplant, in the first 2 to 3 months, there is increased chance of graft rejection, especially in the first 2 months. But if they have a persistent late mixed chimerism, they are stable chimerism, and generally it is acceptable because your goal is to make the patient free of PRVC transfusion. So you want him to make transfusion independent. So even if it's a mixed chimerism, say 1 or 2 years into the transplant, it's still acceptable as long as the patient is not requiring transplant. And the most important thing is, again, in these patients is post-transplant iron chelation. Even though we do early transplant, iron overload still remains a problem in these patients because most of them would have received significant amount of blood transfusions. So the most common thing, most investigators rely on phlebotomy. But now deferasirox has been used up to 6 months or sometimes 1 year in certain patients, and it is shown as effective as phlebotomy. Now, the other common hemoglobinopathy is sickle cell disease. So, kids with sickle cell disease at least have sickle cell crisis, requiring chronic transfusions, and they have other multi-system involvement like diabetes, liver cell damage, thyroidism, hypothyroidism, hypogonadism, restrictive cardiomyopathy. So, to avoid those complications, a curative hematopoietic stem cell transplant is offered. Again, you have to look at the severity of the disease. In a severe sickle cell disease where there is often sickle cell crisis and transfusion dependence, a hematopoietic stem cell transplant, if done early, is curative. But someone who has a sickle cell trait and very rare sickle cell crisis, a transplant is not offered. So even just like thalassemias, they have very good survival of 7 to 80%. And as our learning increases, the outcomes are only likely to increase. So this gives a lot of satisfaction for a transplanter because in leukemias, you, despite best of your efforts, the survival rates are 40% or 50% if you do it in CR1. But in non-malignant conditions, they are to the tune of 70 to 80%. So in which patients do you you advise transplant in sickle cell disease? Age should be less than 16 years and a HLA identical sibling donor. This is very important because if you have an HLA identical sibling donor, you would give this as a very good option. But if someone doesn't have an HLA identical sibling donor, haplotransplant or cord blood transplant is strongly discouraged in sickle cell disease because of inadequate evidence, and haplotransplant especially has high incidence of GVHD in these patients, and the mortality is just not acceptable. So the other symptoms in which we have to evaluate why this patient requires is if someone has a sickle lung disease, nephropathy, retinopathy, osteonecrosis, red cell alloimmunization, recurrent sickle cell crisis causing priapism, acute chest syndrome, vaso-occlusive painful episodes, and someone who's not benefiting from hydroxyurea, and stroke or central nervous system event lasting for 24 hours. These are the patients where there is significant end organ damages which are happening. You consider them for hematopoietic stem cell transplant, especially if there is a match. So now again, what is the stem cell source in which we use for hemoglobinopathies? Now this is the data which is showing in sickle cell disease. So a peripheral blood versus bone marrow versus a cord blood. So there is difference in outcomes where the stem cell source is. So peripheral blood, when the source is peripheral blood, your outcomes are very nice. And when they are with cord blood, again, because of increased risk of graft failures because of low cell dose, the outcomes are lesser as compared to peripheral blood or bone marrow stem cell source. But for hemoglobinopathies, peripheral blood stem cell is good enough. So again, the same classification for risk assessment, we do it even for sickle cell disease as we do it for thalassemias, the chelation, hepatomegaly, and portal fibrosis. But the biggest problem with this classification is we don't know what we define as the inadequate chelation when it was actually proposed. And hepatomegaly of more than 2 centimeters, it's quite a subjective one. So 2.5, 3 centimeters, one would feel 3, one would feel it as 2 centimeters. So, but grossly, any hepatomegaly more than 4 to 5 centimeters, you can fairly think that there is severe iron overload. So now the condition regimen again is Buci along with ATG to prevent your graft versus host disease. The event-free survival is excellent with somewhere between 75 to 95%. The overall survival is almost 90 to 100%. Now, to decrease this risk of conditioning regimen toxicity, you can go for a lesser intensive regimen, including flubu, fludarabine and busulfan, but again there is increased GVHD risk. So you always add ATG for the condition regimen. But sometimes you want to tailor the regimen because you want to preserve fertilities, or in adults to reduce toxicity in severely compromised patients due to underlying disease. Then you can still you can consider flubu with ATG. The other reduced intensity regimens have been used, but again there is high degree of graft rejection, just like thalassemias. Like I said, these marrows are overreactive marrows because there is a lot of peripheral cell ineffective erythropoiesis and peripheral red cell destruction. You would require there is always an hyperactive marrow, and you would require a myeloablative drug. But again, mixed chimerism you see in around 10 to 20% of these patients. But again, you accept it if they occur late into the after some time after the transplant, and the patient is not requiring any transfusion and not having any sickle cell crisis. It's still acceptable if there is some mixed chimerism. Now, the other common disorders which we use hematopoietic stem cell transplant is bone marrow failure syndromes. So among the bone marrow failure symptoms, the ones which are inherited one is Fanconi syndromes and the other inherited anemias. So here, Fanconi's anemia, the most important indication is there is a marrow failure where there is transfusion dependency or severe. The another important aspect of inherited bone marrow failure syndromes is they all have propensity to cause hematological malignancies, especially myelodysplasia and acute myeloid leukemias. So someone with a leukemia or a myelodysplasia and an underlying Fanconi's or inherited bone marrow failure syndromes, they are likely to have a poor outcomes post-transplant. So it is when you identify these patients going into a progressive bone marrow failure, when you do a transplant at that point of time, the survival exceeds 90%. But once a hematological malignancy sets in, and then you go for the transplant, it falls down drastically to 50%. And just look at this, the second graph, which shows the death and secondary malignancy. So this is the problem with inherited bone marrow failure syndromes. Even though you are correcting their blood disorder, they have increased risk of secondary malignancies like solid tumors, skin cancers, colon cancers, lung cancers. So, and they are because of these genetic defects, the chemotherapy or the radiation which we use in transplant are likely to cause secondary malignancies. So again here, just like in hemoglobinopathies, always a HLA identical sibling donor has a better outcome as compared to an unrelated donor. Here again, these are failure syndromes, unlike in hemoglobinopathies where it is a hyperreactive. So when the bone marrow, the cellularity is less, it's going into failure, you may not require that myeloablative regimens. So whatever drug doses are there, you try to decrease those doses so that your incidence of secondary malignancies post-transplant later in their life is also decreased. So the current conditioning regimen generally use fludarabine with a cumulative dose of 150 mg per meter square in combination with a reduced dose of cyclophosphamide, Flu-Cy, which is up to 50 mg per kg cumulative dose, which is almost 1/4 of the dose which we use in myeloablative conditioning. Or if we have to use a TBI based regimen, it is generally 100 to 300 centigrade, where it's a bit higher in the other this one. Now coming to the other important question is common other inherited bone marrow failure syndromes is dyskeratosis congenita. Again, here it is a hematopoietic stem cell transplant is only the curative option. But again, here we have to be very clear when we counsel the patient that the other organ dysfunction, especially the skin and the lung diseases, are not going to go away with your this one, and it limits its indication by negatively affecting the outcome. So someone with other organ dysfunctions, And in progressing cytopenias, doing a transplant in such patients again leads to poorer outcomes. So you only consider transplant in patients who have progressive marrow failure without significant organ dysfunction. And hence, because they have other organ dysfunctions, the survival is lower, 57% and 23%. But since our understanding or our experience treating these symptoms has increased, now the survival has improved up to 70%. Now, the other important bone marrow failure symptoms are severe congenital neutropenia and Shwachman-Diamond syndrome. So, severe congenital neutropenia, they present with isolated neutropenia, sometimes very severe to cause life-threatening infections. So, before the era of granulocytic factors, colony-stimulating factors, the mortality was as high as 50% in the early years. But after these, you start use of these granulocytic growth factors. A lot of patients have come out of neutropenia, and the mortality has decreased substantially. But there are certain subset of patients of severe congenital neutropenia where sometimes even using a dose of 15 microgram per kg per day, also the neutropenia is not corrected. These are the patients where again hematopoietic stem cell transplant is going to help. And whereas in Shwachman-Diamond syndrome, there again the problem is, can I just mute for a minute? I need an urgent call to be taken. Among the other important bone marrow failure symptoms, congenital megakaryo A megakaryocytic thrombocytopenia. This is an interesting disorder where when in infancy the kids present with thrombocytopenia, isolated thrombocytopenia, and slowly there is clonal evolutions to sometimes to hematological malignancies and sometimes bone marrow failure syndromes. So again here you look for a matched sibling donor, but even successful transplant from heterozygous related donors have also been reported. So the other alternative is a matched unrelated donor where the match is at least 9/10 is an acceptable alternative where there is a mismatch only at one loci. Here again, an myeloablative regimen, which includes fludarabine in combination with triosulfan or busulfan is preferred, and the survivals are good except for certain amount of treatment-related mortality, which is 10 to 12%. So most of the data in these inherited bone marrow failure syndromes, you would have only in a retrospective data, because the rarity of these conditions, randomized controlled trial data is generally unavailable. So it is usually done in centers where there is a good experience of transplant and a lot of transplants we do, and there is a registry where we prospectively collect all the data. So among the acquired bone marrow failure syndromes, severe aplastic anemia and paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinemia are two important conditions. Most of the time, both overlap, but severe aplastic anemia is more common. So severe aplastic anemia is usually diagnosed in setting of a pancytopenia and a hypercellular marrow. Typically, the cellularity is less than 25%. And the other inherited bone marrow failure syndromes need to be excluded, especially when patients present at a young age. And the preferred treatment for a severe aplastic anemia is again a hematopoietic stem cell transplant from an HLA identical sibling donor. The transplant from an unrelated donor is considered when there is no sibling donor and the patient had failed after immunosuppressive therapy. So someone who doesn't have a sibling donor, the first choice of treatment is immunosuppressive therapy with ATG and cyclosporin. And if they fail, 40% of them fail that therapy, and they are the patients where an unrelated donor transplant can also be considered. An unrelated donor transplant can otherwise also be considered in patients less than 20 years of age. And when we know that we can find a donor within 2 to 3 months since diagnosis. Because the longer the cytopenias, the increased risk of infusion, infections, and more transfusion dependent, and likely to have a lot of red cell alloimmunization. Now, L-Thrombopac, a drug which is which is used in severe aplastic anemia to improve the platelet counts. Again, when added to the standard ATG and CSA platform, has improved the rates of recovery. But however, still hematopoietic stem cell transplant is whenever there is a sibling match, is a very good modality. And the alternative donor, especially haplotransplant, role in aplastic anemia has been less. You only consider most of the time after the failure of immunosuppressive therapy. So generally, in an idiopathic aplastic anemia, someone who has who is young, age less than 40 years, and has an HLA identical sibling donor, you go with a hematopoietic stem cell transplant with the most common regimen being cyclosporin with ATJ and cyclosporin and methotrexate anti-GvHD prophylaxis. Someone who don't has a sibling donor and age is more than 40 or more, because the transplant-related treatment-related mortality is high, you would first look for a immunosuppressive therapy, which is a horse ATG with cyclosporin. And someone who is refractory or who has relapsed and has a match, there you can consider for an unrelated matched donor. And sometimes when you don't have, you can consider L-thrombobac and you can try to repeat again a immunosuppressive therapy. Rarely you go for an haplotransplant in aplastic anemia, but again it depends upon the transplant center experience. The data is less. Now, the other common conditions in which we use, even though it's rare, is primary immunodeficiency disorders. So when we say about primary immunodeficiency disorders, there are almost 300 to 400 several types of primary immunodeficiency disorders, and the list has been increasing over the years. Some presenting with a milder phenotype and some presenting with a severe phenotype. And we can largely group them into based on the cell defect which they have. Combined immunodeficiency includes, there is a T cell defect as well as a B cell defect. The degrees of T cell and B cell defect can again vary. And certain combined immunodeficiency disorders which are associated with syndromic features. Some purely humoral immunodeficiencies. Some are deficiencies in phagocyte function or number. Certain autoinflammatory disorders, complement deficiencies, and some phenocopies of primary immunodeficiency disorders. So the most our experience most lies with severe combined immunodeficiency. So there are certain factors which influence the outcome, the most important being the preceding comorbidity. So the most important preceding comorbidity is the infectious complications. So someone who presents with a severe infection and with a SCID, the chances of mortality during transplant is very high. So it's very important to pick up these kids earlier. Most of them would have a family history of an early infantile death. So the moment the child is born, do the especially when someone has a strong family history of early infant deaths because of infections, you do the panel, and once kid is confirmed, you take them for transplant. So most common is again a matched sibling donors, but alternative donors have been tried in SCID, especially the cord blood as well as unrelated donors. So, and among the type of SCID where both the T and B cells have are deficient, they have inferior outcome. So someone with a residual B cell function, they are the best ones who would have a very good outcome. The reason being is the hematopoietic stem cell transplants will definitely provide the T cells, but the humoral immunity is not completely restored. So we generally, even in these patients who are T and D forms of severe combined immunodeficiencies, severe cell-mediated and humoral immunodeficiency, you do continue immunoglobulin replacement therapy post-transplant, so that the risk of infection decreases, and sometimes we have to continue this lifelong. And the age of transplant again matters. Someone at a younger age, less than 3.5 months, would have a favorable outcome. The reason being is they still have certain maternal antibodies at that till that point of time, 2 to 3 months of age, where the chances of severe life-threatening infections are low. So the chances of better outcome is more when the age of transplant is less than 300. Now, for a matched sibling donor hematopoietic stem cell transplant for SCID, the survivals have improved over 90%. It is because of an improved learning curve and trying to do your transplants early. So these patients, sometimes they don't even require a conditioning regimen. A sibling donor bone marrow cells infusion into this kit recipients without any requirement for conditioning or GVHD prophylaxis sometimes does cure a lot of patients because because of this infusion there is rapid development of T and B cell function. However, the only T cells of donor origin develop, but myeloid and erythroid cells remain of the recipient origin in such a kind of transplant. Someone who has a T deficient but a humoral, somewhat retained humoral skids, these patients would have humoral reconstitution despite lack of donor B cells, whereas the unconditioned T and B minus kids, the immunoglobulin dependence often persists. So these patients, again, post-transplant immunoglobulin replacement therapy should be continued. So for an unrelated transplant, again, the chance of finding an unaffected sibling is always less. For an unrelated, when you go for an unrelated donor in these patients, again, it has improved because of your good donor registries. But the problem here is they have increased risk of rejection and the GVHD is also high. So you can just not, because they have a HLA match, you can simply not just infuse the bone marrow hematopoietic stem cells in these patients. So these patients require conditioning regimen and these patients require GVHD regimen. But the problem is with the conditioning regimens, when you give in such a young age, there is a lot of toxicities. Younger kids are at a higher risk of developing veno-occlusive disease, especially when you use busulfan-based regimen. So the current inborn errors disease working group, they recommend use of busulfan and fludarabine or triosulfan fludarabine based regimen where the organ toxicities are less. Now, someone with a mismatched family donor or a haplodonor is an alternate option because you don't lose a lot of time searching for the donor. And here, but you do certain interventions to decrease the risk of graft rejection and the GVHD. What you do is a T cell depletion, and from the peripheral blood stem cells, you either employ CD34 minus positive selection or CD3 negative, CD19 negative depletion methods to achieve the T cell depletion around decreasing it by 4 to 5 log reduction. So beyond which the CD3 positive cells in the unit, the blood unit is less than is between 1 to 5, 10 to the power of 4 cells per kg of CD3 positive cells. So when we deplete the T cells in the stem cell source to such a lower level, the GVHD prophylaxis is often not required. And the best results again here is in patients who are less than 3.5 years of age in the absence of any active infections, and even in a mismatched family donor first kit, the best results are still seen with patients who have some amount of humoral immunity. So the conditioning regimens, again, using a myeloablative regimen in children less than 1 year of age is associated with significant comorbidity and leads to survival figures of 50 to 60%. So somewhere where we are thinking of a survival of 80% in a sibling transplant falls down to 50 to 60% when we go for mismatched family donor. Now, other very important use of cord blood transplant is an unrelated is in these patients. So there are certain advantages when we use cord blood cells as a stem cell source because they are rapidly available. You can you just need to match with the cord blood banks registries, and they can have a haploidentical. You don't need a full match, and there is no requirement for a T cell depletion strategy. And conventionally, cord blood units have a lesser risk of GVHD as compared to an adult unrelated donor. And these stem cells also have a greater proliferative lifespan. So And because you're doing it in a small kid, the cell dose is also not a limitation, especially when you use it for SCID. But certain disadvantages like slower engraftment as compared to the conventional unrelated transplant or a sibling transplant. The engraftment is slower by say around 10 to 14 days. Lack of viral specific cytotoxic T cells and lack of availability of donor for a boost. So sometimes when there is a chimerism setting in and you require a boost of the donor lymphocyte infusions, the stem cell source is not available. That's a major disadvantage of cord blood transplant. However, the outcomes have considerably increased to 80 to 90% in the SCID patients based on whatever stem cell source you are using, just because your learning curve is increasing and you're trying to do your transplants early in the disease. Now, coming to a vast spectrum of other diseases, non-SCID immunodeficiencies, there are certain things. So the major difference between this non-SCID immunodeficiency and SCID patients is the requirement of conditioning regimen to achieve engraftment. Like I said, in patients who have a sibling match, in a SCID patient, sometimes just in the infusion of the bone marrow cells of the donor itself is sufficient without a conditioning regimen. But for a non-SCID immunodeficiency, you require a conditioning regimen to achieve engraftment, so that you establish a long-term donor chimerism in the affected cell lineage. The required degree of donor chimerism for a full disease correction varies depending upon the primary immunodeficiency disorder, and we don't know because the list keeps on increasing and the number of patients are anyways few in this otherwise rarer disease. So many children do have other significant comorbidities depending upon the disease or the gene affected. They might be having other organ dysfunctions, other systemic effects, which might preclude the good outcomes. So the conventional myeloablative regimens, busulfan and cyclophosphamide regimens, have been associated with increased treatment-related mortality and treatment-related toxicity. So what to decrease this treatment-related mortality and achieve myeloablation, the EBNT had made certain changes to these recommendations. Because there is lack of trial, it's mostly based on your transplant experience. To replace cyclophosphamide with fludarabine, so BuFlu is the regimen which we consider, or a triosulfan and fludarabine. And because it's a structural analog of busulfan, which doesn't cause much of non-occlusive disease. Now again, to do a reduced intensity conditioning to achieve stable engraftment of immunocompetent donor cells with reduced procedure-related mortality and morbidity. So with this reduced intensity regimens, you are trying to decrease the mortality. But if you look at the outcomes, it is somewhat different based on the type of immunodeficiency. So if a patient who had unrelated donor transplant, the survival rate is around 80% as compared to a matched sibling transplant, which is similar. But in it is around 76% in a pheno-identical transplant, but worse in a mismatched related donor transplant. So mismatched donor transplants, the outcomes are very bad, 46%. And also depends upon the underlying primary immunodeficiency. So patients with Wiskott-Aldrich syndrome, phagocytic disorders, or hemophagocytic disorders, they have a good, better outcome. So as compared to T lymphocyte immunodeficiencies, which is just 47%. Cord blood, when you are using a cord blood donor, even in this similar to SCID patients, even with a mismatched haplo report, I think the outcomes are fairly good, reaching up to 80 to 90%. So among all the non-SCID immunodeficiency disorders, Wiskott-Aldrich syndrome has a very good survival with hematopoietic stem cell transplant to the tune of 90% based on the registry, especially the transplants which we have done after 2000. The outcomes have improved because of a better supportive care, better management of infections, decrease in the treatment-related mortality. Now, other important ones are inborn errors of metabolism. So these inborn errors of metabolism comes to a large group of inherited diseases because of a disordered lysosomal, peroxisomal, or mitochondrial function, and only some of which might be improved with hematopoietic stem cell transplant. So, in inborn errors of metabolism, the leukocytes compensate for certain of these deficiencies in enzyme by the donor leukocytes, and they correct the function to a certain extent. They may not completely cure the disease, but they have shown to control the disease well. So I would be discussing certain syndromes where we have commonly seen in where transplant is done, and the data exists. But the immune-borne errors of metabolism itself is again a vast deficiency, rare disorders, and a huge number of disorders. So transplanting each and every inborn error of metabolism is again doubtful. So I'll be discussing only few of these syndromes. So most common one is Hurler syndrome, which is mucopolysaccharidosis type 1. Here the deficiencies of iduronidase enzyme, which is a lysosomal storage disorder, and which leads to accumulation of these glycosaminoglycans, and they present with mental retardation, severe skeletal disease, and these life-threatening cardiopulmonary complications because of abnormal chest wall, which leads them to frequent recurrent pneumonias and premature death. So what does this hematopoietic stem cell transplant do is it prevents early death. It attenuates these multi-system disease manifestations by the engrafted donor leukocytes, which provides the deficient enzyme to host tissues. So, which is what we call as a cross correction. So the other where I think we had experience with one of our patients, excellent adrenoleukodystrophy. Here again, the problem is there is accumulation of very long chain fatty acids in brain and adrenal glands because of the defective metabolism by peroxisomal membrane protein, which is encoded by ABCD1 gene. So here, what does it do is it prevents the progression of an early cerebral ALD. So these patients have a neurodegenerative condition. So after a certain age, when they reach the age of 13, 14 years, neurodegeneration starts, and it prevents the cerebral manifestations of this neurodegeneration, but not the spinal one. So the neuropathy is not prevented, but the cerebral one is prevented, which is an inflammatory demyelinating disease. So you have to do before the onset of that morbidity. And it happens in around 40% of genetically affected disease, the cerebral form. However, it doesn't influence other manifestations of the disease, which is adrenal insufficiency or myeloneuropathy of the spinal cord. So the other lysosomal storage disorder is metachromatic leukodystrophy. There are a lot of lysosomal storage disorders, and the transplant has been done mostly in these two disorders. So again, it's an autosomal recessive disease where there is accumulation of sulfatides, which is a myelin component due to the deficiency of aryl sulfatase A enzyme. Here again, there is a lot of demyelination in central and peripheral nervous system. So the clinical manifestations are related to the residual enzyme activity. Someone with no enzyme activity have a very severe form of disease, which is the late infantile subtype, the commonest and most severe. So most of these patients die before the age of 4. So what does stem cell transplant do? It doesn't help in this variant, the severe and commonest one, and it is ineffective in preventing the progression of early presenting disease. It only helps in where some patients have a residual enzyme activity. They live into their adolescence or adults, and there they have a greater impact in attenuated disease, where it decreases the progression of disease. So it is more effective in a lighter variants of disease from further progression. But in the severe form of the disease, it really doesn't make much of the help. So when we are doing a transplant in a inborn error of metabolism patient, lysosome, especially these lysosomal storage disorders, a non-carrier matched family donor or a sibling donor is preferred over a MUT over a carrier matched family donor. Someone who's a carrier but doesn't phenotypically is fine. So these patients Again, when we want to do it in a younger age, cord blood is preferred, frequently preferred to bone marrow, since the chimerism is higher in such patients, and the interval between the referral and hematopoietic stem cell transplant is also less. But however, graft rejections are higher with cord blood. So, but peripheral blood, we in these inborn error of metabolism, the stem cell source is either a cord blood or a bone marrow cell. Peripheral blood we rarely use, and haplotransplant is rarely indicated in inborn error of metabolism because of the increased side effects and toxicities. So the conditioning is again is a myeloablative one, where we use busulfan and fludarabine at a myeloablative doses, be it a matched sibling or a matched unrelated donor. So in a correct, in a very selected patients, when your case selection is very good, the treatment-related mortality, especially in the Hurler syndrome, is less than 10% if MUD is done, or MS of a sibling transplant, it is less than 5%. And the survival of a patient who has engrafted successfully is more than 80%. So the other rare inborn error of metabolism, our patient is osteopetrosis, infantile osteopetrosis, where for hematopoietic stem cell transplant is curative. Here again, you don't do it in two conditions. One, when there is neurodegenerative osteopetrosis, or when the osteopetrosis is not intrinsic to the defects in differentiation or function of osteoclasts, like the Rankel ligand 1 or TNFSF11 genetic defects, which also phenotypically present as osteopetrosis, but the bone marrow stem cell transplant is ineffective in them. Here again, the preferred is matched sibling donor, followed by MUD, followed by haplo. However, cord blood is not used here; it is ineffective. And the cost and the standard conditioning regimen for a matched sibling is BuFlu, myeloablative. But for a MUD and haplo transplant, you add thiotepa as an additional drug at different doses. Now, if you want to go for to reduce the conditioning regimen toxicity, you can supplement triosulfan instead of busulfan. Here again, based on the stem cell source, if you are going for a haplotransplant, you go for a post-transplant cyclophosphamide protocol or a T-cell depleted peripheral blood. And the GVHD prophylaxis is similar to what we use in certain hematological malignancies, which includes cyclosporin and MMF in a sibling transplant, whereas in haplo and MUD, you would like to add ATG or Campar, and sometimes both. The treatment-related mortality is less when you use a matched transplant as compared to haplo, but and rejection rate is also very high with the haplo transplant. But the survival with a matched sibling transplant in osteopetrosis is to the tune of 90%, which is very well. And in a MUD, it is around 80%. Again, a very nice survival data where these patients live longer. So the other set of disorders, like most of the disorders which we thought were, most of them are inherited disorders, pediatric diseases, except for aplastic anemia and PNH, which are otherwise acquired disorders. But there is some role of transplant, especially in autoimmune diseases. Not all autoimmune disorders respond to transplant, and here the most common transplant which we do is autologous stem cell transplant. So how does autologous stem cell transplant work in autoimmune disorders? It is what you are actually doing is an autoimmune reboot. So you are actually removing the activated B cells or T cells by ablating the marrow, and when you are reinfusing the stem cells, they just act as a fresh B cell or a T cell, and the immune reconstitution, when it happens later, you believe that the immune reconstitution would not trigger an autoimmune response. So it's just like a reboot, like shutting down your system and rebooting it. That's how. So the most common recent ones is multiple sclerosis. So the first case report of use of autologous stem cell transplant in multiple sclerosis was published in 1985. After that, it has been used in advanced progressive disease as a rescue therapy with limited efficacy. But however, if your patient selection is very good, patients who have active relapsing multiple sclerosis, they have prolonged clinical and MRI responses. So there is some phase 2 study and a phase 3 studies going on. Based on the 4 cohort studies, which included 188 patients, the PFS was to the tune of 70 to 91% at 5 years, which is a very good data, where the progression is defined as a deterioration of 0.5 to 1 point from the baseline disability scores. So and moreover, no evidence of disease activity, which is defined as absence of clinical relapses or disability progression or MRI disease activity, was observed in 70 to 90% of patients 2 years post-transplantation. Now there is a big trial going on, which is comparing the disease-modifying drugs versus autologous stem cell transplant in multiple sclerosis. So sometimes when with this disease-modifying drug, where the disease control is not long enough, autologous stem cell transplant giving a progression-free survival of 70 to 90% is a very good quality of life, if not for a good overall survival. So here again, the conditioning regimen different from center to center. You can use something like a beam with ATG or a high dose cyclophosphamide with ATG. So the recent data shows that if you incorporate busulfan, there are higher rates of PFS, but again, the treatment-related mortality is high. So the currently, who are the patients where this is going to be most effective is relapsing multiple sclerosis, which happens in around 40 to 50% of patients who are younger than 45 years of age, who have had the illness less than 10 years and not very disabled, because the transplant-related mortality in a disabled patient is anyways high, and who have very active disease with evidence of enhancement on their MRI. These patients respond very well to autologous stem cell transplant. Now, other autoimmune disorder where transplant has been tried effectively is systemic sclerosis. The conventional cyclophosphamide-based immunosuppression doesn't have a great outcomes in systemic sclerosis. So based on the recent 3 successful randomized trials, the ASSIST trials, ASTIS trial, and SCOT trials, autologous, which demonstrated that autologous stem cell transplant is superior to cyclophosphamide for early rapidly progressing systemic sclerosis in terms of long-term survival as well as improvement of lung function and skin fibrosis. But the biggest problem with systemic sclerosis is sometimes the cardiac involvement pre-transplant, when you do with a 2D echo, might be normal, but once you take them for transplant and give your high dose cyclophosphamide-based regimens, the cardiac dysfunction may be manifested. So it's very important to do your cardiac evaluations very well, who are familiar with these kind of cardiac dysfunctions, who have seen a lot of these cardiac dysfunctions in rheumatological and other diseases, apart from the conventional ischemic heart diseases. It's very important. A good cardiac evaluation prior transplant in these patients decreases your treatment-related mortality. So early in the disease, if you consider where the Rodnan skin score is more than 50, plus any of the major organ involvement, be it respiratory, cardiovascular, renal systems, the outcomes are going to be good. So you don't want to take them when there is a severe lung or a cardiac dysfunction. Try to take them when the organ dysfunction have just started before that. So the other autoimmune diseases where autologous stem cell transplant has been tried is Crohn's disease and SLE, but we have been largely unsuccessful. But in Crohn's disease, in patients in whom everything has been tried, stem cell transplant has been successful in treating some of these patients, especially preventing these recurrent surgeries, which results in short bowel syndrome and decreased quality of life. Again, systemic lupus erythematosus, people have done, but there is no strong evidence to say that it really works. The most of the successful ones people have seen in juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, which is seen in adolescents, where patients who are refractory to conventional therapies, they have done really well. So just to summarize, the most important conditions where non-malignant conditions where transplant has a big role is hemoglobinopathies, inherited bone marrow failure syndromes, severe aplastic anemias, inborn errors of metabolism, primary immunodeficiencies, and autoimmune disorders, especially multiple sclerosis and systemic sclerosis. With this, I end the talk. Thank you. Now, can take some questions.
Thank you, sir. It was really very nicely explained. Sir, I have a question that is SCID more common in a particular gender, or is it a genetic in susceptibility? Is it there for SCID?
So the point is, most of these kids, they are autosomal recessive. So if they are, what we call, if they are X-linked disorders, then there are the X-linked SCIDs. Then you see most common in male gender. So it depends upon it's basically dependent on the genetics part of it, whether it is an autosomal dominant or autosomal recessive. Most of them are autosomal recessive, or it's an X-linked disorder. X-linked disorder, it's most commonly seen in males.
Thank you, sir.
So I think then we can. There are no questions. We can just end the talk.
Okay, sir. Sure. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for spending your precious time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.